The most interesting place I've visited for a holiday would be Japan. Japan is a very old country and they've got a lot of culture and history in there. And we've visited some temples and they're amazing. They're like huge temples. And it's like it's in the middle of the city, so it's buildings and then out of nowhere there's this really old temple in there. There was one thing that happened during the trip and I thought it was pretty interesting. Because Japan is very famous for its trendy styles and fashion. And so me and my mum thought that I would go get a haircut in Japan. And after we walked into the salon, had a hair wet, sat down, and then we found out that no one speaks English in the salon. So I couldn't explain to the hairdresser what kind of hairstyle I want. So I just ended up choosing a hairstyle in the magazine, and luckily it turned out alright, and yeah, it was a good haircut, and I'd probably do it again if I have a chance. I went there with my mom, and actually it was a very special trip for both of us, because we were both working at a time, and we just didn't have a lot of time to spend with each other, and it's hard to get time to spend with each other for the whole week. And yeah, and during that week we just knew a lot more about each other, and that's why it's so special.
So here's Lester talking about a topic in part 2 of the speaking test. Now, as is the case in about 90% of the prompts in part 2, you have to account for a past experience. So in this case, talk about an interesting place you've traveled to. Now, sometimes in part 2, you have to describe an event that takes place in your country, or an event that takes place in your city, or some other prompt where you might have to use the present tense. But like I said, for about 90% of the prompts in part 2, you need to use the past tense to describe a past event or past experience. Now, if we look at the first criteria, fluency, Lester doesn't have trouble talking. We might be able to say he speaks at length without noticeable effort or loss of coherence. If we look at the running time of his talk, he speaks for about 90 seconds, which is, I would say, minimally adequate for the task. It would be better if you could talk for closer to 2 minutes, but 90 seconds is not terrible. If you speak for 90 seconds, the examiner might ask you some rounding off questions at the end of part 2, just to try to get you to use up the whole 2 minutes that you have at your disposal. Now, the prompt is logically organized. In this example, there are only 3 points. Usually there are 4. So you have to mention where you went, why it was interesting, and who you went with. And it's a good idea to follow the sequence used in the prompt. So when, why, and who. Because if you follow the structure, it'll generally make for a coherent reply. So use this to organize your ideas before you start talking. Now, Lester does sometimes need to rephrase a couple of things, and sometimes there's some hesitation where he thinks about what he is going to say. Now, hesitation is normal, and it's taken into account in the fluency criteria. So if we look at this, they mention hesitation, but there's a big difference between hesitation for content, so thinking about what you're going to say, and hesitation for language, thinking about how you're going to say what you want to say using English. And Lester usually doesn't hesitate to think about how he's going to say it. He just hesitates to think about what he's going to say. So his hesitation is content related. Now, for coherence, when we look at discourse markers and we look at what Lester says, just look at how many times he uses the word and. Japan is a very old country, and they've got a lot of culture and history in there, and we visited some temples, and they were amazing. So a lot of ands in his reply. Here in the middle we can see and again, and after we walked into the hair salon, and in the conclusion, again, a lot. And we just didn't have a lot of time to spend with each other, and it's hard to get time to spend with each other for the whole week, and yeah, during that week, and that's why it's special. So this is not an example of a range of connectives or discourse markers. It's very repetitive, not very flexible. Look here in the second paragraph, or rather here where it addresses the second part of the prompt. He says there's one thing that happened during the trip, and it was I thought it was pretty interesting. So here where he says it was I thought it was pretty interesting, he is self-correcting. That's okay, people do that. But then in the next sentence, because Japan is pretty famous for its trendy styles and fashions, and so me and my mom thought that I could go and get a haircut in Japan. Now this cause here, is this meant to link this sentence to the previous sentence? Because he uses because and so in the same sentence. So it's a little bit confusing to know exactly what this refers to. What is this a cause of? Now, of course, he means that Japan is famous, and so for this reason, he and his mom thought he should go get a haircut in Japan. But it's not very clear that this is actually what he means. So his coherence could definitely be a little tighter. And if you look at the way that Lester's response is organized, he's supposed to explain why Japan was such an interesting place. So the culture and the temples, this should be a reason. So if you're going to introduce reasons, then after saying the most interesting place I've visited for a holiday would be Japan, you should say for one reason, or one reason for this is because Japan is such an old country. So you should use language to indicate that you are giving a reason, even if it's only saying because, or the first reason is something like that. And then the second example of why he found it pretty interesting, it's not really introduced as an example. He just says there's one thing that happened during the trip, and it was I thought it was pretty interesting. So he could use better words to introduce this example of why it was interesting by saying, for example, there was this interesting thing that happened to me when I was in Japan. So maybe use better signposting language. Now if we move on to the vocabulary, Lester uses what we could describe as less common words. Trendy is also a good word to use, but other than that, there's not much, except perhaps this phrase here, and then out of nowhere. This out of nowhere, this is also a good phrase to use. Though there is this phrase, I had a hair wet, maybe Lester means he had his hair washed or something similar, but hair wet is kind of a strange phrase to be using. So Lester's vocabulary, although there aren't a lot of mistakes, doesn't exactly show a huge range. Maybe that's something he could work on. Now Lester uses some contractions, like for example, cause. This is not a problem because nowhere in the band descriptors does it say that you need to use academic words when you do your speaking. When people speak, they very often use informal language. That's not a problem. So also phrases like pretty famous and pretty interesting, don't think that he did anything wrong by using words like that. Now, when we move on to grammar, grammatical range and accuracy, in this prompt, we're supposed to describe a past event. So we're supposed to be using the past tense. But if we look at where he describes the interesting event that happened during his trip, he says, and after we walked into the salon, I had a hair wedge, sat down, and then we found out that no one speaks English in the salon. So it uses the past tense throughout the sentence, but then when you get to the last verb, he uses the present tense. He says speaks instead of spoke. So there's a tiny little slip there. And also a tiny little slip with tenses where he talks about the magazine. So he says, so I just end up like choosing a hairstyle in a magazine. So instead of saying ended up, he said end up. And another problem with grammar is where Lester talks about trying to communicate with a hairdresser. Lester says, so I couldn't explain to hairdresser, there seems to be a "the" missing here. So I couldn't explain to the hairdresser what kind of hairstyle did I want. So this is an example of indirect speech. So instead of saying did I want, Lester should have said what kind of hairstyle I wanted, not did I want. So fairly minor mistakes, and there aren't that many of them.